Okay, so we're going to go right into it. We've got a great keynote speaker today. Chloe Morrow's joined us from Vision Critical. Chloe's got an amazing background. I was like, whoa, she's been doing product management a long time. Like, how do I do this to make her? She's got a lot of experience, so we'll just leave it at that. We'll just leave it at that one. So, number of years with WebCT. Kind of a cool historical Vancouver company that was acquired by Blackboard. Kind of one of the bigger companies, one of the cool wins for the city a long time ago. Spent about 10 years leading product development at Central One, and about 18 months now as a senior vice president of product management with Vision Critical. So I'm super excited you're here. We put a bunch of names on the table when we were trying to figure out whose keynote, and hers was the only one where everybody's like, yes, that's the one we want. So no pressure. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So one thing Stuart didn't mention in his rules is that the law of 2 feet, that doesn't apply here. You can't block it. Seriously, such a great, talented group of people. So I hope that there's 1 or 2 things you can take from my talk today to make your job on Monday a little bit easier. I'm going to talk roadmaps today. There's a lot of people here who have worked with me before, actually, and if you ask any of them, they'll tell you I'm a planner and an organizer, so there's nothing I find more stressful than not having a good roadmap in my back pocket. But it's actually not for the plan. I know the plan is an important part, but it's actually because it's such a potent vehicle for communicating and connecting. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. But before I do that, the organizer said, hey, maybe you should tell us a little bit about who you are before you dive right into that. So if you go look at me up on LinkedIn, this is what you're going to see. I gotta change this picture. This picture was taken when I was at my previous job, which is in financial services industry, where it's a little bit more buttoned down. So this is kind of like very professional Chloe. But anyways, as Stuart said, I've spent most of my career building software in various roles, and mostly in an enterprise SaaS space, and mostly to kind of mid-sized to larger enterprises. So that's kind of work Chloe. This is home Chloe. This was last weekend with my 2 daughters, and we went out to Richmond. They've got these big, massive warehouses of like play places. So between work and 2 little ones, I'm pretty busy. So to tell you my little story of myself before I dive into roadmaps, I thought I'd do a top 5 list, a couple facts about me. So first fact, I'm an engineer by education. So I went to UBC, I have a mechanical engineering degree. And my first job out of university, I worked at a manufacturing plant. And I just kind of like, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. It was the first job that came along, so got this job. But pretty much from like the first week I joined, I started to see things that I thought I could improve through software. And so I started just, I didn't actually really have a software background. We'd done like a little bit of Fortran programming and engineering, which wasn't very useful, but I started to play around with Microsoft Access and a few things. And so I started to just dabble in building little solutions, solving problems, making our lives better. And pretty much by the end of those first 6 years, I was pretty much fully just building software when I was there. And I really knew I had a passion for it. And that was, the next step I wanted to take in my career. Which kind of leads to this interesting fact. I never actually had the title product manager or senior product manager or anything like that. But I've been doing product management almost my whole career before I even knew what product management was. So at the end of that kind of first 6 years, someone said, hey, you'd be really good in product management. And I'd never even heard of it. Didn't even know what it was. But the next job I took at a software company, I was a program manager. That was at WebCT, and we were doing a big rewrite of their application. And so I kind of went in as a program manager, but pretty soon I was the product expert. I think that's a really kind of indicative of things that you see in product managers everywhere, right? It's that innate, just passion to make things better and be like, oh, we could do this so much better. We could solve that problem. And this is also why you find great candidates in other parts of your organization, right? Who aren't product managers today, but you just see them doing those things that are yeah, you're thinking like a product manager. So even though I never directly had that job title, I think I've been doing product management pretty much my whole career, even without knowing it. The third one there, I'm an introvert by nature, and so maybe that's tied to the first one too, a little bit. But, so that kind of first job, when I started to like get more into software and I started to be more customer facing, and I went to events and our own user conferences, and you go to those networking events at the end, you know, you're at sessions all day and then you go network. And for me, that prospect of going to like social hour after the conference, like this was not a fun prospect in my mind. This was not like, oh yeah, I get to chat with people. I'm like, man, how am I going to stand in a room of strangers and like randomly talk about stuff, right? A kind of small talk doesn't really come naturally to me. But I did intuitively know that in order to be successful at my job, I needed to connect. I needed to be able to communicate. How was I going to be a great product manager if I didn't talk to customers and understand what they need? So in a way, I think being naturally introverted actually helped because I treated that networking like a job. Like I treated it like, this is part of my job. I need to learn how to get good at this. I need to learn how to have conversations. And so I took it very seriously, and I read a lot about communication, and I was like very focused when I went. It was probably very awkward for the first ones that I went to, and I carry that through today, you know? Like I really think about communication, and when I'm having conversations with my team or with other people, I'm thinking about like, this is a job I'm doing. This task of communicating is a job, and I need to do it well. And so I think that natural introversion made me really think about it that way. And then like anything, you get better, right? So now I don't find it so awkward, and hopefully if you meet me afterwards, it won't feel weird. Like I know how to do some small talk. And then the fourth one, I'm a parent, as you saw in the first slide. And you know, I knew this before being a parent, but there's nothing like being a parent to make you realize that there are no right decisions, and everybody's going to have an opinion about the decision you should make. Like, should you let your 2-year-old play with the iPad? Should you give her Honey Nut Cheerios for breakfast because those have sugar on it? You know, and if you start doing research, there's going to be like a ton of conflicting data and information, and everybody's going to have their own opinion about what's best for you and your child, and you're going to find the exact same thing at work, right? So, but you have to move forward. You have to make decisions, and that's a quality of a great product manager too, right? Like moving forward, synthesizing all that information and realizing like there's no perfect answer. You could research forever and you're not going to find the perfect answer, but you still have to move forward. So the last point, because I felt like I needed 5, like 4 is a weird number. The last point I was going to say, I'm a nerd. And by that I meant this quality of like, you know, you find some really narrow topic and you're like, oh, that's so cool. Like I just want to like really research and learn about this one topic, and that kind of like that deep dive curiosity. But then maybe because I'm a nerd, I don't know, I thought I better look up the definition of the word just to make sure I don't use the wrong word and it doesn't have some other weird connotation. So I Google searched it. A nerd, the Urban Dictionary definition came up as the first definition. And so I'm like, enjoys learning, perfect. Like that's what I meant. So good, I can use the word nerd. And then I kept reading. If you are reading this article to determine whether you are a nerd or not, you are not. So I was like, okay, I guess I'll just put that I'm a good listener. Okay, but let's get into roadmaps, enough about me. So I started to think about this topic. I mean, I had lots of topic ideas, but I was like, okay, I'll do road mapping, and I started to think about like all the aspects that I could talk about. There's so much out there, and then I started to look at like, well, what have other people written, and then there's so much to cover, and I have lots of opinions on everything, but I really wanted to narrow it down a little bit. So before I dive in, I'm going to just go over what's in scope for my presentation and what's out of scope for my presentation. Plus, I got to have a good product management joke in there. So what I'm going to talk about is really the why. Like, why am I so passionate about roadmaps? And how to use your roadmap as a powerful communication tool with all your stakeholders. What I'm not going to talk about today, although it's a very interesting topic, is like how you pick what's on your roadmap and what form it should take and how you make the decisions about what's on it and how detailed it should be. Those are all great topics. They're topics that are well covered. They're also topics I'm happy to share my many opinions about. But what I really wanted to talk about with this idea that like having a great roadmap and then just kind of like keeping it as your own tool about what you're going to do is such a waste of a super valuable tool that you could be using to further your ability to communicate and connect with people. So I really want to focus on that. Like, you've built a great roadmap. Like, how can you use it? How are the many ways in which you can use it? And I probably use my roadmap in some format or another every week. And I don't know that everybody does the same. So I wanted to kind of talk through what some of those things are. So kind of on the why side of it, there's I think there's a lot of people out there who either have two thoughts, one of which is you don't need roadmaps because we're agile. And the other one is like, well, I have one, but it's kind of like a pain in the ass thing I have to do, and then I get on to my other work. And I'd like you to think a little bit differently about that. So on the topic of kind of agile, you know, I've got these kind of two quotes, I think, that really speak to my feelings about that. Because I do get the line of thinking that, you know, a roadmap is a false sense of knowing the future. And you get stuck in this trap of thinking, I'm just building to the plan I've done, and you're unwilling to change. There's definitely a risk in that. But I like this first quote. Innovation requires dedication, hard work, and discipline. And putting the time in to think about, where is my product going? How am I going to get there? What strategies am I going to use to get there? That's hard work. That's not easy work to do. It's hard work, but you know, I don't see that as counter to agility. Agility means like setting your course, checking your progress regularly, adjusting your course when you see that the information you have is different. But inherent is that you have to have set your course in the first place, right? If you don't have that first, like, here's my course, here's my plan, I don't know that you're being agile, you're just kind of wandering around, right? So to me, there's that necessary step first of setting your course, which is what that roadmap is. Like, here's where I want to go. But yeah, now let's be agile in being okay with shifting from that. And there's a little bit of art there, and you know, don't try to look too far into the future and all that kind of stuff. The second one, roadmaps are evidence of a strategy, not a list of features. Now, the context of this particular quote is a little different than the way I'm going to talk about it. But what I really like about this is this: roadmaps are evidence of strategy. So I think what's important about a roadmap isn't actually the stuff that's on it so much, but it's about that in order to have put the stuff on it, it means, again, you had to have been thinking about where am I going. You had to have been thinking about what am I going to do to get there. So if I go into an organization and they don't have a roadmap, it's not the lack of the tactics that kind of ring a red bell for me. It's like, do they have an idea of where they're going? Does everyone in the organization have the same idea? Do they have the same thoughts on how they're going to get there? Right? So again, it's not the stuff that's in the roadmap that's important. It's that having one kind of shows evidence that you've done some of that thinking. But then the last one that I'm going to focus on a little more today is that I think as a product manager, one of the most important things we can do, you know, we talk about building great product, and of course that's important, but actually a huge part of our jobs, and probably what I spend more of my time doing, is about building trust and relationships. Right? It's about, with all those stakeholders all around us, we have a very powerful job, not by direct people reporting to us, but we influence a lot, and we have a lot of power in the organization. Sometimes we feel like we don't, but we do. And in order to make sure that we're kind of yielding that power well, we need to have really great trusting relationships around us. And I see a roadmap as a great way to be that vehicle to build those conversations, create a framework for those conversations, and a framework for trust. And if you think about kind of some of the aspects of trust, you know, trust means like having a shared set of things that we believe in. It means being transparent about what you're doing. It means delivering on what you said you would do. It means being consistent. Like, every time you come ask me about something, I'm going to give you the same answer, and not kind of waffle here and there. So I'm going to dive in and kind of talk about a bunch of different stakeholder groups and the ways in which you can think about your roadmap or variations on your roadmap to have those conversations, build those better communications, and build that trust. So I'll start with your executive team or your board, or maybe this is just your boss, depending on who you are. And really the conversations I think you want to have with that level isn't about the stuff on the roadmap. It's about, are we aligned on strategy, right? Are we investing in the right areas? What trade-offs can we make? So here's a kind of prototypical roadmap, right? So this is just from Product Plan's website. It's got some good characteristics of a roadmap. It's not too long. I don't know if my pointer works here. It's got a reasonable, let's see if my light up thing works here. It's got a reasonable amount of stuff, kind of split into different product lines. And then it kind of shows how the strategic alignment down here. These are kind of all standard roadmap qualities. Do not bring this middle part here is not the conversation you want to have with your executive team, if you can help it. This right here, this is the conversation you want to have with your executive team. And your executive team or your boss may be in the habit of having that conversation, but I promise you anybody who's having that conversation is probably pulling their hair out, trying to get alignment and agreement on that. You're never going to win that battle. You're going to spend like a year getting approval or alignment on those tactics, and then you're going to be like, that was a waste of time, because now it's like I got to start the whole process again. It's easier said than done, but what you really need to do is focus on those things. Especially if you're new and you're going in and you're starting, it's like, don't show this. Start with showing those objectives. And these ones are phrased kind of like customer satisfaction. I would rather see it phrased as, improve customer satisfaction. And how we're going to measure that, we're going to measure that our NPS score, increased by 2% by the end of the year. That's how you get that strategic alignment, right? That's the conversation you want to have with your executive. Like, what does success look like? How are we going to measure success? And you're not going to get there right away, but over time, they're going to stop worrying about this. Because to be honest, for most organizations, like unless you have a particularly product-minded CEO, this is very confusing. Like, there's a lot of stuff, and they're going to immediately want to start diving in on the whys of all those things, and you're going to give them some very complex conversation about it. And it's going to be frustrating for everybody. But over time, you can get to a place where you focus on those strategic objectives and a lot less on the tactics. And they trust you and your team to deliver the right set of features to achieve those objectives. And the second thing I said was, are we investing in the right areas, and what trade-offs can we make? So an interesting exercise to do is, let's say you've agreed on those objectives for your product, for the next year or next 6 months, whatever it is. Have them have a conversation about how much they think you're going to invest in each of those areas. Because you can still end up misaligned if your CEO, you agree on those things, and your CEO thinks you're going to spend 50% of your R&D team budget on market expansion and split the other 50% across them, and in your head you're thinking, man, customer satisfaction's like in the toilet. I got to spend most of my time just on that, and then I'll spend the last 20% there. So, have a little exercise where you get all the executive to kind of say, well, how would you think we're going to invest in these areas? That's a great tool to kind of get that extra level of alignment. You're going to get a lot of different opinions. And you're also going to have to bump up about the realities where, they may say, I really only want to invest 10% in kind of ensuring that I've got stable infrastructure. And your CTO is going to say, you can't spend less than 20%. Like, we just have to invest that much, right? Those are the right conversations to have. Because once you kind of get that framework, it's a lot easier for you to then go back, especially if you're in a leadership role like mine, to go back to my team and say, hey guys, like, here's what we've got. We know what the objectives are, and we know kind of roughly how much we want to spend in each of these areas. So now you go away and tell me, what are we going to do with that budget to hit those objectives? It also really helps with the trade-off conversations, right? Because back to trade-offs, if you go here and your CEO's like, I really need to get that mobile release out by March and not April. Like, can't we just swap those two things? And you know what you're going to say. You're going to be like, well, no, because that thing's done by team A and the other thing's done, so you can't really trade them, and there's some complex dependency, and super frustrating conversation. But if you can have the conversation that says, oh, you want to hit those improved customer satisfaction scores in June instead of the end of the year, well, we need to invest more there. And that means we need to invest less in performance, and so I'm not going to be able to hit as aggressive performance targets. Like, that's a much easier conversation to have than kind of trying to shuffle all these Gantt bars. And again, I know there's people sitting here thinking like, oh yeah, easier said than done, like my guys, and yeah, it's true, but you can get there. It just takes time, and it takes trust building, right? It takes doing it for a few cycles and showing that you're delivering on what you said you would, and they will start to back off because they don't really want to be involved in those details. And then last one is there's like using your roadmap as a tool to help them help you. So who here has had the experience of your boss or the head of sales or your CEO kind of sidle up to your desk or into your office and be like, hey, so I was visiting customer so-and-so last week, and I promised them we would deliver something or other by May. Yeah, everybody, right? So instead of like pulling your hair out about it, I want you to think a little bit about whether you did enough to prevent that. So, and by that I mean, put yourself in their shoes. They're sitting there with big muckety-muck customer. They're the CEO. So they can't just sort of say like, you know, when the customer says, hey, like, what are you doing over the next 6 months? Because I've got this pet project. The CEO cannot sit there and say, let me call my product manager in to give you a roadmap presentation. And they can't say, oh, like, you know, kind of fuzzy hand-waving stuff. This puts them in a very difficult spot. Like, they need to say something. And so in absence of having something to say, probably what they're going to say is like, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. I'll have my team do that by May. Arm your executive with a couple slides that they can use. Like, make sure they have some roadmap slides that they can talk to that are detailed enough to, you know, divert from the like, hey, shiny object over here to, no, actually, like, here's what my team's working on. And I find too often we don't do that, right? We're not arming them with information, or we think, oh, well, they're the CEO, they know I had a conversation with them. You know, not so. Work with your product marketing team or your marketing team when you do your regular roadmap updates to give them a slide they can put in the bottom of their deck. This is a busy person in your organization. They're probably not going to remember the conversations you had, so when that customer says, hey, what are you working on? Do you think you could build me thing X? You want them to be able to respond with, hey, here's all the great things we are building. And that's a great idea, I'll take it back to my team, but you know, here's what we are building. So think about the ways that you can stop that from happening by making sure they have something alternative to provide. Because in the void of having an alternative to provide, they're probably going to make commitments you don't want them to make. So for your engineering team, talking about using the roadmap with them, and interestingly, I see a lot of times like people don't do a great job of sharing the roadmap with their engineering teams. And sometimes it's because it feels like they're bored and they're not interested, or you just get busy. But you'd really be shocked at the number of teams when you like start talking with a developer or a team who like have no idea about what's ahead for their team. And so either they don't have a sense of urgency, like you're there thinking, oh my God, I've got all this work to do and I don't have enough people to do it, and the dev team doesn't seem like they have the same sense of urgency. Maybe they don't have the same sense of urgency because they don't see the things coming that you see. But also a lot of them, like a lot of times I've had conversations where it creates a sense of fear and uncertainty for those teams because they don't know what's ahead for them. And they start getting worried. And of course you're not going to have the best performing teams if like they don't know what's ahead in their future, they can't see the exciting things coming. So really make sure you're letting them know what the future is. You're letting them see how much work is ahead. It both helps create that sense of urgency, but also gets them excited. I would really resist the request, because you'll get this request, resist the request to say, I don't want you to give me, I don't want the whole team sitting there for an hour-long roadmap presentation. Can you please just carve up the roadmap into the things that are for my team and present them in an isolated way to each team? Please don't do that. Because it is important for them to see the whole context. And as much as sometimes like you might get some glossed over eyes, I do think it's really important to make sure they see the big picture. And again, you got to do it every quarter or every month or however often you're doing it, and it does start to sink in. But carving it up into too small a piece is not going to help there. It also helps build that deeper understanding of why. And that understanding of why is really hard to see in those siloed things, right? But you want the team to see that strategic alignment. You want them to know why the features they're building are important. And presenting it in the context of the roadmap is a really great way to do that. You're going to have better teams if they understand the why. They're going to be coming with more creative solutions. And yeah, that's one more voice and one more opinion in the mix. Sometimes you think that, but you know, it's a great voice to have in that mix of thinking about how do we build great product. The other thing is I think that your roadmap should really contain all the major pieces of work you're doing, including significant pieces of re-architecture or tech debt that you're investing in. Don't kind of hide those things down off, which sometimes happens. You're going to earn a huge amount of trust and respect from your engineering team by showing them on the roadmap. Because it shows empathy, right? It shows that you understand that for them to go fast, sometimes they need to invest in fixing something that's happening today. It doesn't mean throw everything on the roadmap they want to do. You still need to put it through some testing, like what business value am I going to get out of it? But it really changes the conversation. I think you'll really see increased trust levels if you're like, I hear you. I respected your advice, and I put something on that you suggested onto the roadmap because you told me it was important for us to invest in this now to be able to go faster in the future. So again, really important way to build trust. It's also a really great way, especially if you don't have formal project management, to focus with your dev leadership on capacity planning and team structure. So I work in an environment right now, and I know a number of people do, where we kind of have like squads or feature teams that own a particular area of the product. And so there's some natural gating of the amount of work you can do because you've got a single team in an area, and so you're kind of gated by that. In an ideal world, teams should shift to meet the business needs. So if you've got more work over here, the teams should adjust. And I actually think most VPs of engineering would agree with that, but it's not a shift you can do like that. Like, it's not a reasonable expectation to go to your VP of engineering and say, like, hey, I need to double the size of this team and shrink the size of this team like tomorrow. So a roadmap can really help you look forward and see and have that conversation with your engineering management, like, you know what, like the current team structure and capacity we have for these teams made sense for what we were building last year, but looking forward, it looks like we need to invest more heavily there. And if you give them 6 months or 3 months runway, they can make some of those shifts. They're just not going to happen like, in 30 seconds, right? People need to get retrained. You need to figure out how you're changing those things. So then for other internal teams, and by that I mean like support or customer success, I think in a lot of organizations, those roles feel like they've kind of been left like on the front lines with like no ammunition. Like they're at the front line of like, why does this work like this? And when are you going to add that feature? And sometimes they get really frustrated with the product organization, and you might go into an organization and feel like there's a lot of mistrust. I know we felt that a lot when I joined Vision Critical, like a lot of mistrust and kind of bad feelings between those. So building those great relationships was hard and took a lot of time. But if you can be repeatable and you can be really transparent about like, hey, here's the things we're doing on the roadmap, here's what's coming, here's what you can expect, and you can do that in a repeatable way, you really start to build their confidence and trust. And maybe more importantly than knowing what we're working on, letting them know what you're not working on is equally important. So when they're talking to a customer on the phone who wants improvements in such and such area, it's actually really powerful and empowering for them to be able to say, hey, you know what, that's not something we're working on right now. And customers would prefer that too. It's the same with fixing bugs, right? Like I, as a customer, would rather know you're not going to fix my bug, and so I'm going to find some workaround, than to have this like continuing promise that like, yeah, maybe we're going to work on it, maybe we're going to work on it, right? So giving them the power to know those kind of things and have those conversations. And again, help them help you. I don't know about you guys, but I don't want to be the only person who gets called when someone has a customer that they want to talk to about features that are coming, right? Sometimes that happens like every single conversation about are you going to build this or not ends up coming to product management. Empower them to have some of those conversations. And sometimes you might actually need to put actual words in their hand. Like, hey, when a customer asks about this, here's something you can say. You can say, yeah, that's an area of the product we're investing on over the next couple quarters. We're really focused on solving these business problems, and I'll forward that use case to our product team. Like, you can cut off some of those requests that are going to come to you by empowering them with words they can use with customers. And there's probably sensitive areas that you do want them to have the conversations, but there's a lot where you can let them have that conversation that they're going to feel more empowered. They're going to feel happier about their jobs. And again, you're building that trust. I also see that as a way to stop this madness. Like a lot of times support organizations and sometimes CS have one of two standard responses when someone asks for a feature that doesn't exist today. Either, great idea, I'll send it to the product team. Like, and that's the only thing they ever answer for anything, right? Like that's not very satisfactory for customers. Or they say, it's on the roadmap. Like everything's on the roadmap is just like the infinite backlog of everything you ever might do, right? Also not super satisfactory. So I don't really want my internal teams giving only one of those two answers. Like I want them to be empowered to give more nuanced answers to that to customers. And again, if you can do this in a repeatable way, you will start to build that confidence. And again, that trust cycle with all your internal stakeholders is so important to you being successful. And then for customers, and this is kind of, I spent a little less time here because it's a bit more obvious, but, I pretty much every time I talk to a customer, I give some form of a roadmap presentation, even when they don't ask for it. even when the customer success person says, I'd like you to talk to this customer because they've got these 5 pain points that I want you to address, but they don't want a roadmap presentation. Because I think they equate roadmap presentation with being sold something. And I try to push back on that and say, you know, like if I just go in and I talk about these 5 things, first of all, you're probably not saying yes to those 5 things. Like if you go to the customer and you're like, yeah, we're doing all those 5 things. Well, they probably wouldn't have asked you to have the conversation in the first place, right? So more likely than not, you're going in there to say like, maybe, no, you know. If you just go to a customer and say like, no, we're not doing that, like the obvious question is like, why not, right? So I always try to start, and if I know the customer's like not receptive to a roadmap presentation, I'll go in and I'll say like, hey, I know you don't want a full roadmap presentation, but I do think it's important for you to just kind of understand the context of what we're working on, and so I'll do like an adapted version. I might strip out stuff that I know is really not important to them. I try to do it relatively quickly, but it's important to paint the picture of what you are doing, right? Because then when you tell them what you're not doing, it's in the context of what you are doing, right? So they start to understand like that there's some trade-offs there. And hopefully, if you've done a good job, when you talk about what you are doing, they're going to be excited about those things you are doing. And even the customer's going to go like, oh yeah, you know, like even though this is my niggle, like yeah, those are really important things I'm excited about. And you start to, again, build that confidence with your customer. And this is maybe more relevant, especially in like an enterprise sale or a larger enterprise sale, where the customer's not investing in the product you have today, right? They're investing in you as a company and your future. So it's really important that you build that confidence that not just about what you have today, but that you have the right strategy for the future. So you're kind of reinforcing that, like we have a strategy, we have a vision, we know where we're going. And again, if you've done a good job, they should hear themselves in that roadmap, right? They should see, oh, you are listening. I see that your roadmap reflects things that are important to me, right? And again, so that's an important thing about building trust. Like they hear themselves, they see themselves in that, and you start to build that. And you build in that little bit of understanding about your constraints, right? You might not get there perfectly, but they start to understand that like doing the things they want means you can't do some of the things that are on your roadmap. I don't say that explicitly to them, but naturally through talking about what you are doing, you kind of start to build a little bit of that understanding. So again, and that's not really about, the importance here isn't about that the things on the roadmap are what they want, but it's about that it's a vehicle to have those conversations. And it starts to open up new paths, you know, and it starts to be a natural place then to talk about the roadmap and be like, you know, we're hearing from other customers this kind of pain, and so we're focused on that. Like, you didn't mention that in your 5 things, but are those things that resonate with you? And they're like, oh yeah, those are things that resonate with me, right? And you start to shift the conversation from the urgent problems to, you know, the bigger business problems they're facing. So those are kind of the key stakeholders. Hopefully, maybe there's a few things in there that you can take away in terms of using that roadmap for better communication. I do have a few parting thoughts that go beyond that a little bit. And the first one is back to that idea of, you know, like agility versus having a plan. Like, don't fall in love with your roadmap. As much as I've said, I love roadmaps, I always want to have a roadmap, it is important not to fall in love with your roadmap. And that's hard to do, right? So you have to remind yourself of that, because if you've invested a lot of time in researching the market and doing user testing and all this upfront work, and you've built this like awesome roadmap, it's really hard when you release the first little piece of functionality and you get some different feedback than what you were thinking to like abandon the thing you spent 3 months working on, right? So I know it's a hard thing to remember, but I always try to put that as like, like think about that ahead, so don't invest too much time, but also don't fall in love with it. You have to be willing to divert from that plan, right? That's that important lesson about agility. Second one's about be accountable. I don't see very many people do this, and by this I mean, you know, if you update your roadmap each quarter, or each month, or every 6 months, when you do the update, go back and look at how you did on what you said you would do 6 months ago. Perfection is not the goal, right? It's not the goal to say like, I said I would do this and I did exactly that, because that's working to the plan. That's not what we want to do. But that shouldn't mean you shouldn't check. You shouldn't know. Like, oh yeah, we did about 75% of the things we said we would do, and about 25% we didn't. And some of that 25% was due to real valid business reasons. Some of that was due to we messed up, we didn't plan effectively, right? So just like your teams, if you're doing Scrum, your teams are doing retrospectives every sprint on how to improve their performance. reflect on your road mapping. Like, how are you doing? Are you doing a good job? And if you want, and you feel confident enough, share that with all those stakeholder groups, right? That accountability aspect is what builds trust. So you're saying like, hey, here's what I'd said I'd do. I'm about to give you the next update, but let me just reflect on how we did last quarter, right? That shows transparency. That shows accountability. It shows people that you're paying attention and that it's important to you to understand how you're doing performance-wise. And then the last one is about being repeatable and predictable. So if you go into a new organization, for example, or you go back to your organization, you're like, I'm going to revamp our road mapping process, and you put all these processes in place, and you build this awesome roadmap, and you do a first round where you like meet with everybody in the organization to give them the roadmap overview, and then like you never do it again, you haven't really gained very much. So you need to think about a process that you can do repeatedly and effectively every single quarter or every single month or however often you're doing that. And it's a lot of work. Like, we do our roadmap update quarterly, and I do probably like 10 presentations related to it. I do one for engineering, and then I do one for each regional CS team, and then I do one for the support team, and then I do one for our leadership team, all slightly different, right? It's a lot of work. Like, it feels exhausting to me sometimes, but I know how important the predictability of that is, because they come to rely on it. They know that I'm going to do the same thing next quarter, and I'm going to reflect on how we did. And all of that goes to that building trust. And that is such an important aspect of being effective as a product manager, that trust building, that relationship building. So don't design a process you can't repeat. Focus on doing less, but repeating it effectively. And then if you can do more, do that the next time. But if you can't get a good repeatable cadence in, it's kind of a waste of time to do it as a one-time shot. That's it. Again, I hope you learned a little something or could take a little something out from that. And if you want any of my opinions on the other road mapping topics, I'm happy to give them at lunch or during networking.